I think we are live now. We can start this session.
Yes.
I take this opportunity as chairperson of this first cornea session. I believe there are 6 cornea sessions for the entire day. And the first session is one of the most important aspects, not only for a corneal treating physicians, even for a general ophthalmologist. Infections are, I think, the major part we are dealing with. And I'd like to welcome the delegates who have joined us today in this lively program, and my other chairpersons, Dr. Parikshit Gokte, Dr. Sonia Kothari, and Dr. Parul Deshpande, and the moderator of today's session, Dr. Rajiv. I request Dr. Rajiv to take over and initiate the session.
Good morning, all. Welcome to this webinar, conference. I request Co-Chairman Parikshit Gokte sir to introduce first speaker.
I am having problems with my virtual background, Dr. Rajiv. Can you do the needful?
You can put off that background because that's causing problems.
Hi, good morning, Rajesh Bhai. I hope you are fine.
Good morning.
Okay, Parikshit, you can introduce. We can.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning, Rajesh. Welcome
Good
back.
morning, sir. Thank you, sir.
Let us start, I think, with the first talk, Dr. Bhupesh Bagga. We all know he is from LV Prasad. He is the person who is doing maximum amount of work and research on corneal infections. And we are lucky to have him here with us today to speak to us on how we should really approach infections. So Bhupesh, please start. And we'll try to maintain time so that we don't delay the next sessions.
And I have been lucky to hear Dr. Bhupesh teach in Indonesia. And well, he's been doing this work and has been volunteering and teaching all over the world. Over to you, Dr. Bhupesh.
Thank you very much. Thank you for kind introduction, Dr. Nikhil. So my slides are visible and okay. Okay.
Yes, please go ahead.
So I'm going to discuss in approach to microbial keratitis. In my talk, I will brief a few aspects of microbial keratitis and how to approach clinically as well as microbiologically. So to manage microbial keratitis is to first most important is to make diagnosis, then medically and surgically manage appropriately. So two later aspects I think will be covered by all the other speakers, and I will basically limit myself to approach or to make diagnosis. So, but all to see if you are seeing an ulcer, so you need to see basically to size of epithelial defect, size and type of corneal infiltrate, depth of infiltration or involvement, anterior chamber involvement, and limbal and scleral involvement. So this is basically too important when you are examining any ulcer in the cornea. And this is basically, if you stratify, you can pinpoint many times a correct diagnosis. Also, you should not forget to examine conjunctiva. You should examine the margins and contour. Like here in this case, you're seeing the rose Bengal staining of the conjunctiva. And this is basically a patient of dry eye, Sjogren's syndrome, along with corneal epithelial changes. And if this patient develop corneal infiltration or secondary bacterial or fungal infection, then only treating with antifungals or bacterial won't help. So you need to be basically careful about managing in both aspects. So examining completely adnexal, lid margin, contour, lashes. Like here you're seeing the distichiatic lashes are rubbing against the cornea and causing non-healing defects, or leg ophthalmos. So these are the cases where you need to be complete examination of lid margin, conjunctiva, adnexa, puncta, Meibomian gland status, tears volume, corneal sensations, unilaterality or bilaterality. So this is basically an overall examination of your eye and then going on the corneal ulcer. Very important part is diagrammatic documentation, which we often say to everybody whosoever examining the ulcer, that please document each and every point of ulcer and on each visit. And actually, if you document properly, you can manage all the ulcers at least 90 to 95% of time in an appropriate way. Coming to diagnosis point of view, if you are seeing an ulcer, after documenting all the points, you need to confirm the microbiological, what are the bug which is responsible for that particular ulcer. If you have approach to confocal, you can actually make a quite good diagnosis by seeing these filaments like as a fungus, nocardia. I'm not going to in brief in detail of all these pictures, but you're checking that filaments, very thin filaments, beaded filaments as nocardia or acanthamoeba or microsporidia like that. But most important and most easily available is the corneal scraping part, where you need to see direct bugs under the microscope. Like here you're seeing the filaments or bacteria, gram-positive bacteria, or seeing the and confirmation by growth. And if you are having approach to third generation of microbiology lab, you can use of Vitek and get the susceptibility of the each in every bacteria, which particular antibiotic, or which you can go to the species level also. But to manage, in most of the time, if you are able to get the diagnosis at the bacteria or fungus or particularly the species level, you can manage much better way as compared to empirical treatment. Most important in the diagnostic procedures is to corneal scraping. So I will just brief for all the delegates that you should not forget, this is the most important step. Use 50 number blade. Very gently you can make direct smears with KOH, calcifer white, or if only plain KOH and direct observation under microscope, and grams with both the scraping, and inoculate medias like blood agar, chocolate agar. And if you're high suspicion of acanthamoeba, inoculate non-nutrient agar and with the Escherichia coli overlay. Then SDA and PDA along with some liquid medias like BHI. These are the very important and you can say the most important step before making the diagnosis and before starting the treatment. Similarly, if patient is wearing contact lens, and many times we see contact lens induced keratitis, don't throw the contact lens, and very importantly to send that contact lens for microbiological diagnosis. And sometimes that is the only evidence to get the microbiological diagnosis. So based upon the clinical features also we can make diagnosis. Whenever ulcer comes, based upon the sign, you can classify into mild, moderate and severe. And bacterial keratitis essentially is of acute onset, and you can get a shorter duration, wet yellowish infiltrate with always increased conjunctival signs, chemosis, congestion and discharge. And surrounding cornea gives you a lot of information, like a lot of cellularity in the particularly bacterial keratitis. After confirmation from smears that you are dealing with bacteria, start with a combination of antibiotics. In most of the time it works, either fortified cefazolin or vancomycin available along with ciprofloxacin. And later on, based upon the growth in the culture media, you can change the antibiotic. Few organisms can tell the story on examination as well. Like this is a patient of 1 day history of contact lens wearer, stromal cellularity along with the infiltrate and diffuse infiltration along with central thinning. You can't forget this picture, and you can pinpoint that this would be a gram-negative bacilli and most likely Pseudomonas aeruginosa, and which heals with the use of antibiotics as well as judicious use of steroids. Streptococcus pneumoniae, like similarly having a patient is having spheroid degeneration, having one risk factor. You see the infiltrate is going like a serpiginous way and leaving an area of necrosis. And you see that as difference to Pseudomonas, this is a little silent, but yes, this is Streptococcus pneumoniae keratitis. On other way, fungal keratitis is a little bit longer history, whitish, dry infiltration with feathery extensions, and most of the times having satellite lesions. And while scraping, you will feel a gritty sensations. For any pigmentation, definitely supports fungus. So these are the few history. These are the few examples of which I was about to tell that this is like a pigmentation. If you're seeing picture like this cannot be any other organisms except fungus. And you see the emacious fungus like picture having pinhead colonies, dry looking infiltration. Sometimes this can be a mimicker like a viral keratitis, but most of the times it gives you correct diagnosis on clinical examination. So based upon the filaments on KOH, you can start topical natamycin, which is very easily available along with azoles, in particular moderate to severe or mid to posterior stromal involvement, or along with hapopion. Sometimes you deal with mixed infection like this picture. Patient has like this, on treatment developed secondary bacterial infection, and on re-scraping we got the bacterial infection along with fungal infection and managed accordingly. Pythium keratitis is basically a relatively newer organism which mimics closely as fungus but behaves differently as compared to fungal. And there are certain features which actually on microbiologically you can pinpoint. This is the aseptate and broad ribbon-shaped filament as compared to fungus. And treatment is entirely different as compared to fungus. We deal with the antibiotics, azithromycin and linezolid and combination. Coming to acanthamoeba keratitis, you see history of use of contact lens, ring-shaped infiltrate, relatively longer history as compared to acute bacterial infection, where also you see set of ring infiltration along with radiculokeratoneuritis. If these are the signs, you should have a differential of acanthamoeba keratitis as well. So, like this patient is having radiculokeratoneuritis along with pinpoint lesions, and this is the classical ring infiltrate which you see. Treatment is biguanides or combination of biguanides, diamidines, azoles, or newer drug like miltefosine. Use of steroids is relatively
Keep it
judicious
short, sir.
after 2 weeks of anti-acanthamoeba therapy. Like this patient of having diffuse infiltration along with radiculokeratoneuritis got smears on grams and KOH confirmation of double-walled ring, and on treatment resolved completely. Similarly, other organism which is not so common in some areas and very common in few parts of India, microsporidial keratitis, and basically presents in both forms, superficial as well as deep, and in many times confused with adenoviral keratitis, which is relatively more common and more commonly seen. But the difference is you see the stuck-on appearance, and picture like this you will not forget. But in OCT also you can differentiate that these lesions are raised, and then the endokeratoconjunctivitis lesions are basically subepithelial infiltration. So both treatments are different. In this, the simple debridement and lubricants many times is you can say treatment of choice. You don't need specifically treatment. Sometimes they need voriconazole as one of the treatment modality for management of superficial punctate keratitis, particularly for recurrent type. And you on staining you will see this type of structures which is gram positive, and on KOH calcofluoride you can't forget this type of rice stain like picture. On follow-up by debridement only and lubricants, you get complete recovery, and many times this does not recur. This is relatively very rare set of diagnosis, but very important diagnosis, macrosporidial stromal keratitis. They are closely mimicked with HSV stromal keratitis, which is very common. Many times, if you see that HSV stromal keratitis along with KPs and pigments, relatively longer history and often on recurrence, and basically responding with steroids and recur back, keep the differential diagnosis of microsporidial stromal keratitis. And this is basically treatment of choice. At present is not very much in medical, and you need to go for surgical management.
Keep it short, sir, please.
Yeah, so atypical mycobacteria is last organism which very, very rare. You see longer history with crack field appearance, and treatment of choice is amikacin along with oral clarithromycin. So we should not forget nocardia also, which is not very common, but yes, superficial beaded sort of, you see the beaded filament in the grams, and on the cornea, you see the wreath-shaped appearance and filtrate. So on summary, you need to take a detailed history of onset, complete slit film examination and documented properly, make clinical differential diagnosis, and then corneal scraping for microbiological complete workup, and then follow accordingly for signs of resolution as well as worsening. Thank you very much, and thanks Dr. Nikhil and others for giving me this chance.
Thank you, Dr. Bhupesh, for this very succinct talk.
Next.
Next, we have Dr. Revati. She's going to talk on evidence-based medical treatment for fungal keratitis. Dr. Revati?
Yep.
Yeah, you can start.
Yes, sir, I'm going to start. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, Dr. Revati, we can hear you.
Yes. Can you see my slides?
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, sir, and Dr. Nikhil as well as BOA for giving me this opportunity. And today I'll be talking about what are the evidence-based, yeah, evidence-based, what the actually the literature, how it can guide us in making a treatment option in case of fungal keratitis. And I am going to confine myself to the research or publications from our country, because any infection, it has its own regional relevance. So we can't just follow what is given in the Western textbook. So luckily, most of these publications or research, they have come from our own country, and we can, based on our decision, we can be based on these papers. So we'll go on, like first, this is from the lab side, what is going on in the basic research, basic laboratory research, and what we can, these are not translational so far. It has not come into clinical practice, but we can expect them in future. Some of the promising things, one is the next generation sequencing, with which we can even diagnose many of the, identify new species of particular genera, which can be reported first time in the ocular pathology. So this sometimes when we treat a fungal keratitis, we know only Fusarium and Aspergillus. For example, when we tried this in some of our Aspergillus isolates, along with the Szeged University in Hungary, we could identify at least 6 new species of Acanthamoeba, which Aspergillus, which has not been reported before. So we don't know how they are going to behave. So this can be, this can shed more light for us later. And also the many research is going on proteomics in the tear film, with which biomarkers can be identified, with which we can identify the organism, or we can even predict the prognosis. And the third one is of more interest, the smart probes for different organisms. These are very simple to use. They can, instead of dyes, we can use them for the smears, and with the simple light source, easily fluorescent organism can be identified, and we can identify whether it is gram positive, negative, or fungus. This may be useful as a point of care diagnostic tool, as even a bedside tool in the pulmonary aspergillosis. It is proven, but still it is in the experimental stage. Soon it can be available, and it can be used even in vision centers and primary centers. And of course, artificial intelligence, they are about to create. And then come to the what other things the lab can offer, the susceptibility pattern. Of course, in fungus, we cannot have the culture sensitivity for individual cases day-to-day basis, but the large labs attached to large ophthalmic institutes, where large number of isolates are being processed, they can now and then do this susceptibility test, especially whenever a new agent is introduced, and they can give us some idea how it can be useful for us. And this is one of the sub-analysis of the mycotic ulcer treatment trial study, in which they have shown that Fusarium isolates have better MIC values for natamycin than voriconazole. This is some kind of a idea it can give. And also, like, we can, how it can be correlated to the, is it correlating to the clinical outcome? Of course, in natamycin, they could find some correlation, not in voriconazole, but of course, this can be a biased one, because in mycotic ulcer treatment trial, most of the organisms are Fusarium. Coming to the susceptibility pattern change, this also the labs should do it at regular intervals to see whether the pattern is changing. So this again, during the mud study over the years, when they observed, there is a change in MIC value. The voriconazole has become more and more less susceptible, less effective against organisms that they could find, at least by MIC values. And this also found out in systemic aspergillosis also. So they suspected this could be due to indiscriminate use of the azoles as fungicides in the agriculture field. So this again can be a warning why some of the drugs which we expect that it can be useful are not working. And then come to the culture part. The baseline culture as well as a repeat culture after you start the treatment can also throw some light about the prognosis. For example, if a patient is already using antifungal agent after a week or two coming to you and still the culture is positive, you can be sure that the organism is not responding to whatever treatment at present. You have to augment the treatment or plan for a early surgical intervention. Same way after week treatment, if you again repeat, if it becomes negative or the organisms are less, then maybe you have to titrate the your antifungal agent if the signs of inflammation is more. Otherwise, you have to, if it is still positive, maybe you need an early intervention. Coming to the topical agents, which are of choice now, from the two major studies, one is MUD study and also another one is from LVP. They ratified that natamycin is the first line drug of choice for Fusarium keratitis, definitely. But what about the other non-Fusarium organisms? Still, we are not very sure. I couldn't find any such large RCTs talking about whether voriconazole alone can be started or other azoles will be effective. We have to wait and see. And another study showed iconazole also equally effective as natamycin in case of Fusarium keratitis. Whether combinations can work as then we should know whether they are synergistically work or not. And in systemic infections, fungal infections, of course, even combining two azoles can give good results, but we don't know still in our ophthalmic practice. But some of the studies done on augmentation with intrastromal and intracameral antifungal, they have not shown a very promising thing. At least they are not showing any bad effect, but of course they are not showing any additional value. But of course, still we have a practice. Of course, when you see an infection which is progressing or something, we need to do something more. So as an addition, even with the polyene, we can add voriconazole or as an intrastromal injection. No harm in trying, but we have to keep in mind, we should not be keep on repeating it without assessing the response. And coming to oral antifungal, again, we did a study on ketoconazole because we selected this because of the economical reason, patient can afford, and also it has some spectrum against Fusarium, but we couldn't find any additional value with this. But again, voriconazole studied in MUD2, we couldn't find any great value added to the topical therapy. And Dr. Namrata Sharma from RP Center, again, they studied both ketoconazole and voriconazole compared, and again they found that they couldn't find any great advantage, but comparatively voriconazole has a slightly better result than the natamycin. When we go for oral therapy, we have to keep in mind the cost as well as systemic side effects. And generally, personally, I prefer them only when they are very large, going towards the limbus or after therapeutic keratoplasty or something. I try to use them. And coming to the other mode of therapy, the collagen cross-linking, nowadays it's being talked very much in as a treatment in infective keratitis. Its role in bacterial keratitis is relatively proven, but in case of fungal and Acanthamoeba keratitis, it's not yet proven, especially in its present form, the riboflavin 1%. With the Dresden protocol, it's not found to be very useful. But some suggestion that if we use 2.5% riboflavin, it might be useful. And again, another recent intimation from the research which is going on in Bascom Palmer with Rose Bengal PDT. Rose Bengal as a photosensitizer with a green light is supposed to be effective in vitro both against Acanthamoeba and fungus. And RCT trial is on the way, and I think that will give more promising result probably. And then we can we have one more agent in our armamentarium to tackle these infections. And other drugs also we have to keep in mind. I don't know, somehow amphotericin B, which could be better against Aspergillus keratitis. The area of in our countries, in northern areas where Aspergillus is more common, probably they might be using ampho-B more than natamycin. I'm not very sure. Maybe friends from RP Center, they can throw light on this. And I personally go for it when, in case of non-Fusarium keratitis, when natamycin is not found to be working, I used to switch over to ampho-B. And one study from PGA shows the liposomal amphoby may be less toxic, but equal effect with the regular amphoby, but it's, of course, the cost is a little bit more. And caspofungin is supposed to be another promising one. And I tried it in 2 cases with contact lens related fusarium keratitis. And these both cases, to my surprise, complete resolution. Of course, caspofungin with natamycin, resolution occurred in 2 weeks' time, which I thought for a fusarium keratitis is really good. Maybe we have to still probe this agent also to add into our armamentarium. So in conclusion, from the literature evidence, natamycin is a good first-line therapy choice for fusarium. And for other things, of course, we need to add other azoles, but the synergy is not yet proven. And augmentation with systemic or regional therapy is not well established. But of course, in practice, many times we do that. And about the collagen cross-linking, maybe the present form may not be very useful. We have to look for other form of PAC-CXL, which may be promising. And it's also time to look for newer formulations or newer drugs. And also maybe it's time to start conversation with the authorities to regulate the therapeutic use of therapeutic antifungal agents in industries like in agriculture. Even natamycin is being used in food preservation industries. And another sub-analysis from MUT is showing that even natamycin is showing the higher MAC value towards the end of the study. So these things are a little disturbing, and maybe we have to look into that also. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam. Now I request Radhika Natarajan, Madam, to talk about bacterial keratitis protocol. She is Deputy Director of Cornea and Refractive Surgery Department at Shankar Netralaya, as well as she is Head of Department for Teaching and Training Program over there. Over to Radhika Natarajan, Madam.
Thank you. Are my slides visible?
Yeah.
Yeah. Good morning. I'm Radhika from Shankar Netralaya. Thanks to BOA and Dr. Nikhil in particular for having me here, and warm regards to Dr. Tityal sir. My topic today is bacterial keratitis protocols, and I'm going to be sharing some clinical snippets with you. Gram-positive bacterial infections are usually well localized and whitish. They have distinct borders and they are dry looking. On the other hand, gram-negative infections usually are more suppurative and exudative, and they progress more rapidly. In the panel below, you can see some unique infections in their typical form, especially the pinhead infiltrate of nocardia, which Bhupesh showed earlier. Every corneal ulcer needs to be scraped unless there is a reason not to, and bacterial keratitis is no exception to this rule. Drug holiday, if it is possible to give without retarding the healing, it is better. The leading edge of the ulcer has to be scraped. Otherwise, we'll end up just with pus cells or bits of scar material. In bacterial keratitis in particular, it is important to measure the epithelial defect after scraping, because in bacterial keratitis, half the damage is because of the infection and half because of the inflammation. So re-establishing the epithelial barrier is imperative for curing of the disease, and therefore the epithelial defect healing needs to be followed up. And some of the bacterial infections may look whitish and not yellowish, resembling a scar tissue, but overlying epithelial defect, injected eye, etc. show that activity is still in place. You can see there a nocardia infection which looks whitish, but it's definitely not a scar. It is very much active. So it should be remembered that white is not always quiet in bacterial keratitis. The common organisms reported from literature are Strep pneumoniae, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, and like Dr. Revati mentioned, we see a lot of nocardia in India. And in SN, largely we see gram-positive organisms followed by gram-negative bacilli, but we're also seeing more and more diphtheroids in our practice. Virulence-wise, top on the list is Strep pneumoniae with its serpiginous ulcer, sometimes can be associated with a sac infection. Next is Pseudomonas with its central ring infiltrate and relentless progression. Earlier, gonococcus used to be a neonatal threat, but with modern hygienic obstetric practices, we don't see it much nowadays. So the two main groups of drug therapy for bacterial keratitis include the cephalosporins and the fluoroquinolones. This is a crowded slide, but it may be safe to say that earlier generation cephalosporins work well for gram-positive infections, The later generations work as broad spectrum. Likewise, earlier generation fluoroquinolones work more for gram-negative infections, and the later generation are more broad spectrum. So that is the bottom line with the treatment with these drugs. So some trends from SN I would like to share is that commensal infection is definitely on the rise, like I said earlier. And so is the resistance to fluoroquinolones, not surprising considering the rampant use, not only in human practice, but also in veterinary practice. So we have gone back to resorting to gentamicin for gram-negative infection, which is resistant to fluoroquinolone. Very severe Pseudomonas infection sometimes fade in the face of fortified gentamicin, provided the sensitivity pattern shows susceptibility. Also, the recently launched higher concentration levofloxacin may also be tried for these resistant gram-negative infections which don't respond to fluoroquinolones. So monotherapy can be adopted for small central ulcers, whereas large melting ones which are in the visual axis will require combination therapy. Vancomycin is a Brahmastra. It should be used only as a drug of choice for methicillin-resistant Staph aureus and not randomly for other infections. And the rare Moraxella may respond to fluoroquinolones. That's what we've seen occasionally. Suppose the panel shows multiple drug resistance, then what to do? Then it is time to resort to some unconventional antibiotics. Linezolid is an antibiotic which has come to the fore because of possible use in Pythium keratitis. But a lesser known fact is it also seems to work against gram-positive organisms quite well. And when there is a non-responding gram-negative infection, imipenem may be the go-to drug of choice. Sometimes when the infection is recurrent, one has to look for a septic focus in the nose or throat like an otitis media or a tonsillitis. Recently, I had a patient with a recurrent streptococcal small ulcer in the cornea, heel and breakdown kind of ulcer. And later we found that he had multiple boils on the scalp and the infection resolved completely after dermatological control. Adjuvant treatments include steroids after complete control of infection to reduce the scar. The SCUT study showed us some moderate benefit. Povidone iodine is a disinfectant. It is a surface sterilizer. It treats where it touches. So while it may work well for some superficial infection and the rare bacterial conjunctivitis, deeper infections, it does not penetrate. There is zero effect for deeper infection. It's also a stinging medication. Doxycycline is a modest antibiotic, but a wonderful anti-inflammatory, and therefore its role as an adjuvant. Oral antibiotics should be used only when the blood-aqueous barrier breaks down, like in post-op infections or post-traumatic bacterial keratitis. Cross-linking, like somebody mentioned, has seemed to be effective in the form of Paxlovid in moderate bacterial keratitis, not the severe ones. But these bacterial ulcers, you can see, have reached the limbus. So when we do therapeutic penetrating keratoplasty, these carry a high chance of recurrence. So what we did in SN was we cross-linked the donor cornea, not the infection, mind you, the donor cornea, and we also cross-linked the graft-host junction. The strengthening effect of the CXL on the donor cornea and the sterilizing effect of the CXL at the graft-host junction to eliminate any residual infection seems to prevent the chance of recurrent keratitis in these patients, and we have reported the same. So I will quickly run through a couple of unique situations. The first is a case of lichen planus, which is an autoimmune disorder with the bacterial ulcer. It was a streptococcal infection. It responded nicely to antibiotics. In picture A, you can see the scarring infection. The scar brought along with it a pannus. So the corneal ulcer did not melt the cornea, but the pannus did, considering the autoimmune background of the condition. And in picture C, you can see the melt. So it was only when we recessed the pannus completely that the resolution actually happened. So two diseases were at play over here, the infection on one hand and the autoimmune inflammation on the other hand. So this again is a case of recurrent persistent epithelial defect because of trigeminal injury. This patient kept breaking down and healing. The epithelial defect kept breaking down and healing quite often. We tried everything under the sun for the PED. You can see that in picture A and picture B. One of the recurrences, he came back with a secondary infection. Our heart sank because there's one more complication to treat now. We scraped, it showed Staphylococcus. We started treatment, and to our surprise, when the infection healed, the scarring that it brought about caused better epithelial adherence, and the PED never recurred after that. Not that we suggest infection as a treatment for PED, but sometimes when two diseases are at play, we need to watch out for interaction between both of them. So this cracked windshield classic appearance is a reminder that the glass ceiling is yet to be cracked in bacterial keratitis, and the future shall look forward to that. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you again, madam.
Thank you.
We have the next.
Thank you, Dr. Radhika. It was a wonderful talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Can I request Dr. Vikas to present his next talk on corneal perforation and various management modalities?
Dr. Vikas Mittal, he is from Ambala. He is the medical director of LJI Institute, Ambala, Haryana, and he is practicing cornea and the anterior segment since last 15 years, and he is a trained cornea fellow from LV Prasad Eye Institute. So I welcome Dr. Vikas Mittal to give his talk. Vikas, are you there?
Can you see my slides?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, okay. Thanks so much, BOA, Dr. Nikhil, and it's a wonderful session going on this Sunday morning. So I'm going to talk on perforations. Okay. So we know that, if there is a loss of corneal tissue, the ideal would be to replace it with the cornea, but it has its own issues. So we are going to talk in this presentation on the alternate modalities that we have to take care of corneal perforations. So these are the four modalities that I'm going to show: cyanoacrylate glue, multi-layered AMG, 10 patch graft, and lamellar corneal patch graft. And how to use, I'm going to show you these videos that how do we use these modalities, and then maybe briefly we'll discuss how do we choose it. So let's see the first one. Cyanoacrylate glue, inexpensive, easily available. I hope this plays. Okay, so this is how it is available in the ampule. You can place it in a syringe and just place it with a 1 drop. This is a sterile sheet. This is a patient who had a corneal perforation, can confirm with CDLs. You can see here, there's a leakage. Very important point in using glue is remove the epithelium, at least 1 or 2 millimeters surrounding. Then on the back of the mirror cell sponge. So what I'm doing is just making it a thin layer so that excess glue remains there on the sheet, the sterile sheet itself. And then you just touch it, within seconds, it gets polymerized. And it's very simple. You have to ensure that the necrotic tissue and all that epithelium is knocked off. Sometimes there's a continuous leak and you have to take the patient in OR. There you can do it under the air. But sometimes even under the air, you can see there was a fistula in this case. So there was still leaking. So even air was leaking. So what I've done here is used a simple sterile sheet, the drape sheet, and then you can close it with a cyanoacrylate glue. So if there are vessels, so these vessels will grow inside and we'll heal it later on. So this is how it works. So if you have a perforation, and then you can place this glue, and under the glue, this epithelium heals. Of course, you have to take care of the primary issue, whether it is infection or sterile or whatever it is. You have to take care of that. So once it healing, the epithelium heals under it. Once the epithelium is healed under it, this glue gets loose, and generally it takes sometimes 2 to 3 months, sometimes even more. And then you don't have to maybe after 2-3 months, you can just check it with a sponge, see if it is loose. If it is loose, then only it should be removed. Otherwise, must not be used some force. Otherwise, you get that perforation again. And again, it attracts vessels. That is a good healing property, and has its own antibiotic properties as well. The second modality is multi-layered amniotic membrane grafting. This patient had, after pterygium surgery, he had a peripheral melt. So this is a pretty old video. So at that time, we used to use, this amniotic membrane, you can fold it maybe twice or thrice, just like we have this chapati or paratha. You can just fold it and, suture it with 10-0 nylon suture. You can see it here. So here, if there's a perforation in the periphery, it's good. Whenever you're using a multi-layered AMG, it's good to have, conjunctiva over it. So here I had done a pedicle conjunctival graft as well. So this heals pretty well. You can see this. Another patient who had undergone a multi-layered AMG. Here there was infection that had resolved, but there was a small perforation which was not, getting sealed with a TA. So we had to use a multi-layered AMG. So if you can do a multi-layered AMG even with the fibrin glue. So in this patient, this was a neurotrophic cornea. You can see old graft, and there was a small central perforation. So this we want to, whenever we want to put some tissue, so this amniotic membrane helps, especially multi-layered AMG, when you want to place some tissue as well. So replace some. So you can see this is the first layer. So I've used both thick and the thin composition of fibrin glue, and then excess fibrin glue is cut, and this is the first layer, and over it we'll place another layer of amniotic membrane. You can see here, you can use 2 layers or 3 layers also, but you'll have to ensure that you have to use fibrin glue again. So this is the second layer. So I'm using a fibrin glue over a layer of amniotic membrane, which is already placed over there. And you can, secure it nicely. So you don't need to put a suture, and this generally stays well. You need to ensure that, epithelium is debrided surroundingly, so that the epithelium will grow over it. In this patient, we had done a tarsorrhaphy as well, which works very well for neurotrophic cornea. You can see this pre-op and post-op photograph. So as I said, when you want to fill in some tissue, use a multi-layered amniotic membrane. The epithelium will grow over it, and it generally merges with the stroma, and you can see a scar later on. A third modality is tenon patch graft. So this patient had a sterile melt periphery. You can see. So the tenon patch graft, you have to use a tenon. So I'm using a inferior valvular conjunctival part, this fornix part. So you have to dissect the tenon first superiorly, and then under the tenon. So you have to ensure that it's a very thin, so you don't cut through that tenon graft that you want to harvest. So this is the anterior dissection, and now this is the posterior dissection. So once dissection is done, so you just chop off this tenon graft. So this is harvesting is done. So in this area, so you again at least 1 to 2 millimeter remove the epithelium, and I like this pocket. So if you make just 2 millimeter of pocket all around, so it's very easy to tuck in this tenon graft in. So once there is this small tunnel. So I'm just tucking in this tenon graft the periphery, and over it I'll use a box suture. So it is very important. Initially it tends to swell up, but later on, in follow-up over a period of 1 to 2 weeks, it generally settles down. So here I'm using a box suture so that you can press it. In case there's a ocular surface disease patient, you can place a amniotic membrane over it as well. So this was placed at first fibrin glue, and then over it you can place a box suture. You may or may not use air, and this area again was sealed with fibrin glue. You can see this another patient where the perforation was managed with a tenon patch graft. In case you have a really bad melt, you can see this, even the surrounding area is really bad. So in these cases, you have to remove this necrotic area and then do a lamellar patch graft. So here you can see even the surrounding, although there's a perforation is big, even the surrounding area, this is also very much edematous, and margins were really not good. So what I did, I planned to do this was a tissue which was left over after dissect. So I've just made the marking. So what are the dimension that I want to take, and then chop off. This is the tissue that I'm going to use for this perforation, and even the surrounding area. So this, I think, peripheral part of this patch graft, I'm just trimming it, and all this necrotic area will remove it, so that you have a good host where this patch graft will stay. And then you have to hand fashion it according to the shape that you have. So this again, and this tissue, you can use it, the one which we have left over with the dissect. This is a post-op. So if you have a really big perforation, unless you are in a COVID situation where tissue is not available, then you may think about tenon. Otherwise, straight away corneal tissue only. How to choose? What is the size of the perforation? So in case for smaller perforation, like less than 2 millimeter perforation, TA is ideal. You can use tenon and multi-layered also, but if it's a sterile melt, central melt, those kind of patients. If it's more than 2 to 5 millimeter, so then you can use a tenon patch graft or multi-layered AMG. More than 5 millimeter, or depends. If there is a surrounding tissue loss also, better to use a lamellar patch graft. Peripheral, if the location is peripheral, because there will be easy access to blood vessels. So if you want to use multi-layered AMG, use for peripheral perforations, and for central you may prefer tenon patch graft because that's more physiological tissue. For infections, TA is better. Avoid AMG tenon in all infection. If you see that there's infection as well, use TA or cyanoacrylate glue. In ocular surface disease patients where you want some epithelialization, you can use TA. But for sterile males like rheumatoid or Sjogren's, those cases, tenon graft works beautifully well. Consider, as I said, amniotic membrane over tenon graft if you want to just prompt this epithelium also to come over so that you can give a basement membrane as well. Logistics again sometimes depends whether you have an accessibility to the AMG at all. Tenon patch graft is not a very difficult skill to master, and every general ophthalmologist should know, and there are lots of videos available on YouTube. We also have put these videos on YouTube. So, and then depends whether the patient is fit for going in OR, you can do a TA easily in the OPD, and stay flexible. It's not that one modality fit all. It's possible that you have used one modality that failed, you can try other modality as well. Cause of collagen loss is very important. You need to check what is the basic etiology. It's infection, continue your anti-infectives. If it's a sterile, continue systemic immunosuppressants, steroids, whatever you want to give. So that is very important. Doxy, apart from being an antibiotic, is very helpful in checking the collagen losses. You can give whenever there's a collagen loss, you can give a course of 2 to 3 weeks doxycycline. So overall, choose where is the perforation, what is the location of perforation, what is the etiology of perforation, and what are the logistics in your practice. As I said, stay flexible. I hope that covers most of the modalities. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Vikas.
Can you unshare?
Yes, I'm trying.
Next speaker is Dr. Sujata Das. She'll be talking about microsporial keratitis. She is a medical director for Drishtidan Eye Bank at LU Prasad Eye Institute. Dr. Sujata Das.
Thank you, BOA and Nikhil, for inviting me. I'll be speaking on microsporial keratitis. So basically, it is not so rare. I just wanted to highlight that this is a common disease, and it was mostly reported after the era of HIV. Around 50 years back, first microsporial keratitis was reported. But we have seen more cases for the last 30 years, both in immunocompromised as well as immunocompetent patients. Though it was initially thought that it will be more common in immunocompromised, but nowadays we know that it may be common in immunocompetent patients. It occurs worldwide. There's no limitation of geographical area. It may be more in one geographical area compared to other. And prevalence rate has been reported from 0 to 50%. The route of infection is fecal and oral transmission. It is a source of ocular infection, however, it's not clear. If you see the reported literature, initially it was case report, then few case series in 2001. I've seen those because it shows how it increases from one case in 2001 to we have reported to 78 cases. After us from Madurai, there is more number of cases. So the increased incidence may be due to increase in awareness among ophthalmologists. Initially, we reported this as cause of epidemic keratoconjunctivitis. Otherwise, epidemic keratoconjunctivitis was mostly known due to adenovirus. Two distinct clinical entities, mostly keratoconjunctivitis is very common. Stromal keratitis is not so common. I'll restrict my talk to keratoconjunctivitis and stromal keratitis. Keratoconjunctivitis is one of the easiest thing to diagnose. If somebody sees a patient, you may not need microbiological diagnosis to confirm. These are diffuse lesion. They're multifocal, coarse, minute. Mostly the size is less than 1 millimeter, raised, round to oval. And IEL congestion, you can see, it may be fluorescent positive or fluorescent negative. It may be diffuse or localized to one area. So these are typical target lesion. If you see this, you will not forget in your lifetime the microsporial keratitis. There will be mild congestion in contrast to adenoviral conjunctivitis, where the congestion is more in membrane. Most common differential diagnosis is adenoviral keratoconjunctivitis. You can see as KP here. This is usually seen once the surface lesion resolves. is mostly in the second visit when this come, the surface lesion will not be there, but keratotic precipitate will be there. This is seen in around 20% of cases, those who present with microsporidial keratoconjunctivitis. There are reports of limbitis and diffuse endotheliitis. So you can see the newspaper cutting because it is mostly thought that adenovirus. Till now, people think this is adenovirus. There are coexistence of adenovirus, but microsporidia. However, microsporidia, some findings are very typical, which can differentiate between adenoviral and microsporidia. Second differential diagnosis is herpes simplex keratoconjunctivitis, which is not common. Same thing, chlamydial keratoconjunctivitis is not common, and TSD. This is typical of adenoviral keratoconjunctivitis. It's usually bilateral. Microsporidia is mostly unilateral. Adenoviral, although bilateral, it is asymmetrical. The lesions are less than 1 millimeter. Their coarse, their hedgy, fuzzy border. In contrast to microsporidia, where it will be well demarcated border. And subepithelial infiltrate, hedge will be there. The lesion will be polymorphic. Some lesion will be resolving, some lesion will be active. There will not be any clear area. There will be interlesional corneal hedge, whereas in microsporidia, rest of the cornea will be clear. If you notice the conjunctival finding, there will be membrane, there will be bleeding, and patient will have prodromal symptom like fever and sore throat. Another differential diagnosis is Thygesen, which is bilateral, and waxing evening course, it will not be 1 week course, it will be intermittently, patient will be symptomatic. There will be subepithelial hedge, the migratory lesion. Sometimes you see the lesions are here, the next visit the lesion will be different places. Again, the congestion will be mild. Usually they come with a history of months to years. Coming to stromal keratitis, it may come as a suppurative keratitis or non-suppurative keratitis. Most of the time they come with a suppurative keratitis. Most common differential diagnosis like keratoconjunctivitis, most differential diagnosis adenovirus. Here's most differential diagnosis is herpes disciforme keratitis. Till now, most of the time we get confused. We start with antiviral and steroid. They come from non-suppurative to suppurative. Then you do scraping because most of the time there will not be any epithelial defect. And vascularized corneal scar, it is not diagnosed clinically. Once we do penetrating keratoplasty or lamellar keratoplasty, we send to histopathology. The diagnosis comes from histopathology department, or they may present with perforated corneal ulcer with edema. So most of the time when the culture is negative and it is not responding to standard medical therapy, we should have a strong suspicion of microsporidia. These are few of the photographs where it's a microsporidial stromal keratitis. If you see these two photographs, the dirty looking infiltrate and the scapies are not reported yet, but we have noticed the scapies are mostly, it is extended beyond the lesion in contrast to herpes, where the capies are just behind the infiltrate. The risk factor for microsporidia has been reported. HIV is the most common. However, this is now we should not take HIV as a common risk factor. Then systemic immunosuppressant, contact lens wear, trauma, and bath in pond water is especially a common risk factor in our part of the country. The use of upper respiratory tract infection, use of surface water. This we reported almost 10 years back. We reported 278 cases that time, and the mean age mostly it is for the young people. The duration of symptom is 1 week, and KP, as I told, is 20% of cases. Most likely does not affect the visual acuity. Superficial scar is present in 40% of patients, and most of them reported in the month of August. So rainy season is the most common season during when the present. In our institute, this is 20% of all microbial keratitis, is almost 1/4. As you see, it is throughout the year. However, it's mostly in the rainy season. Most common symptoms with the present is redness, followed by tearing or foreign body sensation. Prior medication, as you can see, people use antibiotic, antiviral for microsporidial keratitis routinely. If you see the simple diagnostic test, although GIMSA is not routinely practiced, but KOH can diagnose in 99% of cases. KP, as I told, is usually seen after 1 week. Time of resolution is almost 1 week. Final outcome, most of the time they improve with a good vision in superficial keratoconjunctivitis. Clinical features is very typical. If you have access to confocal microscopy can help you diagnosis. However, easiest thing is microbiological probe. It helps both in diagnostic as well as therapeutic. By doing this, you debride the lesion. These are for academic interest. If you are doing a keratoplasty, or the corneal button can give you a clue of microsporidial keratitis. Other tests like PCR can help you to know the species if you are not getting anything in smear, especially in stromal keratitis. Various treatment has been tried for keratoconjunctivitis. You can see the number of drugs has been tried, starting from PHMB, chlorhexidine, and albendazole. Surgically, epithelial debridement helps in early resolution, although it is a self-limiting disease. If lesions are not many, you can just give lubricant. And, in contrast, stromal keratitis, there is no medical therapy except 2 or 3 case reports where the lesion has been responded to medical treatment. There is no response, and preferable is penetrating keratoplasty because there are reports of recurrence in deep lamellar keratoplasty. It has penetrated to the Descemet membrane, intact Descemet membrane. We did a RCT long back PHMB versus lubricant, and we found there is no significant difference if you use PHMB versus lubricant, suggests it is a self-limiting disease. So I'll conclude, it is more commonly seen than believed, especially keratoconjunctivitis. There is an emerging ocular infection in immunocompetent patient. Though rare in as a stromal keratitis, it can lie dormant without any associated inflammation, especially culture negative cases. We should have high suspicion. Debridement helps in early resolution keratoconjunctivitis. In contrast to belief that where it progresses to stromal keratitis is not usually reported. In absence of medical therapy, we should plan for early penetrating keratoplasty in case of stromal keratitis, where usually the result outcome is very good. There's hardly any recurrence if you do early keratoplasty. Simple microscopic evaluation is invaluable in diagnosis of microsporidial keratitis. Thank you.
Dr. Parikshit, you're not audible.
Hello. I request Dr. Sonia Kothari to introduce next speaker, Dr. Aditya Pradhan.
So I welcome Dr. Aditya Pradhan to present the next topic for today, that is herpetic keratitis for general ophthalmologists.
Thank you. Good morning to everybody. I'll just get straight to the slides. So I have no financial interest in any of the products mentioned in the presentation. So some unique features which are a challenge for everybody is that basically varied presentations make it a great masquerader for everybody. The treatment varies as per the anatomic layer involved. The steroids are necessary unlike other forms of infective keratitis, and any delay in initiation of the steroids can result in a great threat to the vision of the patient. Again, unlike other forms of keratitis, here there is a definite role of prophylaxis of oral antivirals, and it helps in preserving the sight of the patient. It is definitely not a one-time event. It can keep on recurring, as we all know. And compared to other diagnostic modalities which are more difficult for easy accessibility and cost, clinical diagnosis in herpetic keratitis is still the gold standard. So certain guidelines came out by Dr. Chodos and then later on, which I will be basing my talk on. So the first term which was the change which was proposed was that instead of giving different names for the forms of herpetic keratitis, the proposal was that you just identify the layer which is involved, and then you simply call it as HSV epithelial keratitis or stromal keratitis or endothelial keratitis, rather than all these confusing terms on the right hand side. But as we know, the keratitis is caused by a mixture of either the manifestation, the replication of the live virus on the surface, or sometimes it is an immune mediated reaction. So basically the epithelial form of the disease is due to live virus. So here you need topical antivirals. In the stromal, The necrotizing part has a live viral component, but the non-necrotizing, that is the one without a epithelial defect, the reaction is primarily immune driven. That is why the role of corticosteroids. In endotheliitis also, there is minimal role of live virus and more of immune reaction. Again, the role of topical corticosteroids. In anterior chamber, it is a mix of both. There is live virus circulating in the anterior chamber as well as the immune reaction. So if you see this kind of a presentation, please be very careful. This is definitely not innocent, and these patients tend to perforate in a matter of few days or few weeks. This is basically on the left-hand side, you see a neurotrophic cornea, which has resulted from multiple episodes of stromal keratitis. You can see the collagenolisis is well into place. On the lower right, you can see this geographical ulcer, where basically the cornea is neurotrophic due to recurrent inflammation, and these tend to perforate very quickly, so be very careful. So as I said, clinical diagnosis is very important. So basically, first identify on the slit lamp which layer is involved. So once you know which layer is involved, you can work on the differential diagnosis and treat accordingly. Fluorescein staining is your friend, don't ignore it. Please don't dismiss corneal sensations. Mostly in our hustle and bustle, we forget to check, but there are very few conditions in cornea which actually reduce corneal sensations. The chief one is herpetic keratitis. So with just a sterile cotton wisp, it's very easy to check the corneal sensation, doesn't take much time. So if you have stromal disease, it is basically having a mid to deep stromal infiltrate with minimal necrosis and thinning. The chronic forms can present with deep vascularization. There can be lipid keratopathy, there can be scarring. If it is endothelial, there can be diffuse or focal stromal edema. There are keratic precipitates on the endothelium, sometimes difficult to see because of the overlying edema. The advanced forms can present with a microcystic epithelial edema as well. So Dr. Bhupesh published a study recently in IJO regarding the role of multiplex RT-PCR, in which corneal scrapings were done from the patients having a diagnosis of herpetic keratitis. And it was found that it reliably detects both HSV1 and 2 and also the zoster variation of it. But again, accessibility is a problem, especially for solo practitioners and smaller institutes. So for the treatment, if you are having epithelial disease, which you can easily identify with fluorescein stain, antiviral agents alone are the treatment of choice. In India, we are lucky to have topical antivirals. Topical corticosteroids should not be avoided in the initial management as the live viral replication is going on. So if you have stromal keratitis, the dosage of topical corticosteroids and oral antivirals has to be for at least 10 weeks. But if there is stromal keratitis with ulceration, you have to wait for the ulcer to at least heal or reduce in size before you initiate topical corticosteroid therapy, lest you precipitate a melt. If it is endothelial version, you just have to give topical corticosteroids and oral antivirals for a longer duration. Between acyclovir and valsaclovir, which drug you should choose, the choice is pretty easy. The bioavailability of valsaclovir is at least 5 times that of oral acyclovir. So that is why the compliance, the dosage is also reduced and the compliance is better. So if the patient can afford the drug, definitely please go with valsaclovir compared to acyclovir. I have dedicated one slide for steroids because many mistakes are occurring here. Basically, it's the most common source of therapeutic setbacks in the management of the immune manifestations of herpetic disease. So basically start with prednisolone acetate 1% or its equivalent. Please give the frequency which is commensurate with the degree of inflammation you see on the slit lamp. Please maintain the initial dose of steroids till you see a complete control of the active inflammation. This is pretty much like treating anterior uveitis. And never taper the steroid more than 50% of the initial dose at any one point in time. At every dose reduction, please call the patient, and if the inflammation is rebounding, go back to the original higher dose and wait till the inflammation goes down. If you terminate the therapy abruptly or prematurely, basically many of us tend to label it as recurrence or reactivation, but actually it is not that. It is just a pseudo recurrence. Another myth is that the steroids have to be stopped. That is not true. In certain chronic cases, you may have to keep the patient on micro doses of steroids, maybe prednisolone or a soft steroid for lifetime, unless there are other side effects of steroids. So it's not necessary that steroids have to be stopped in every patient. sometimes a challenging case may come to you in which you have to maintain them on microdoses of steroids. There are certain indications for prophylaxis of recurrent keratitis in which the patient has to be on long term, maybe for their entire lifetime. Most common is either you are performing any intraocular surgery or keratoplasty in these patients, in which you have to continue prophylaxis for life. The cost of prophylaxis for acyclovir, that is 400 milligrams twice a day, for 1 year comes out to be around 10,000 rupees. For valcyclovir, 500 milligrams once a day is enough for prophylaxis. For 1 year, it comes out to be around 17,000. It is not much of a difference in terms of cost, but certain patients may not be able to afford, so acyclovir can still be given in them. This is again commonly asked whether it can be given in pregnant females in the first trimester or breastfeeding, lactating mothers. Definitely is. A large number of cohort studies have shown that it is extremely safe. This patient, however, presented to me last year during the lockdown. This is a very severe form of herpetic zoster ophthalmicus, in which the patient was an intravenous drug abuser and was on intravenous acyclovir before he presented to our clinic. So zoster is also extremely dangerous, and it's a systemic disease rather, and the ocular inflammation is more severe compared to herpes simplex. There are certain vaccines available, but not very promoted or common in the Indian subcontinent. So again, the role of oral prophylaxis in zoster eye disease is not as straightforward as herpes simplex, but most of us tend to give it for a longer period, at least 400 milligrams twice a day. The zoster eye disease studies, ADDS, is currently being recruited, and maybe we'll have an answer that how much duration should we give oral prophylaxis in zoster eye disease. Again, one interesting case I want to show. This patient presented with this deep stromal or endothelial exudates, which was mimicking like a fungal keratitis, but the scrapings came out to be negative. A week after empirical therapy, this patient presented with this diffuse form of stromal edema with a subepithelial infiltrate. The dense infiltrate had gone down. But again, before we could start any therapy or investigate, the patient was lost to follow-up. 6 months down the line, the patient came back with this manifestation. Now this is very much clear. It is an endothelial form of the disease, and proper initiation of topical corticosteroids and oral antivirals led to the resolution in about 6 weeks of time. If the cornea is neurotrophic, never underestimate the power of a simple suture tarsorrhaphy. The epithelium starts healing very rapidly, and maybe in some cases you can avoid the cornea going into perforation. So if you're planning to do any intraocular or refractive surgery in patients with a herpes simplex or a herpes zoster, please start oral prophylaxis at least 1 week before the surgery at the prophylactic dose. So the take clinic message is that it is a very potentially blinding disease. It is not uncommon in the country. You should have a very high index of suspicion to diagnose it. If you see a bilateral disease, either suspect immunocompromised status or the patient has atopy, or you are dealing with a child. If the epithelium is ulcerated, please balance between the healing and the initiation of the steroids. As I said, valcyclovir is definitely superior but costly. Please give oral prophylaxis before surgery and refer on time. Do not give oral acyclovir in adenoviral keratoconjunctivitis. It has no role. There is no routine benefit of giving ganciclovir gel over acyclovir. Do not give NSAIDs in these patients. Do not continue topical antivirals beyond 14 days of time. It is very epitheliotoxic. If you're doing surgery, do not disturb the epithelium unless it's necessary, as in refractive. If you're giving oral antivirals, do not give in subtherapeutic doses. When do you refer? If you're a general ophthalmologist or do not have much experience in handling herpetic keratitis, if you're dealing with a pediatric case, please refer immediately. If the patient is one-eyed, if it is a necrotizing variant, if the patient is immunocompromised, if the presentation is atypical or it is not responding to your therapy, or if it is recurring frequently, or there is a superadded bacterial or fungal infection, or there is endothelial decompensation which you are seeing on the slit line. In all these instances, please do not waste any time and refer immediately. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Aditya, for nice talk. After this, I'll request Professor Dr. Rajesh Sinha sir to talk on adenoviral conjunctivitis. Professor Rajesh Sinha, sir, he is professor at RP Center. He's in charge of cornea and lens and refractive surgery services. He's also currently treasurer of AIOS and secretary of ISCARIS. Over to Dr. Rajesh Sinha, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Rajiv. I would also like to thank Dr. Nikhil, Dr. Parikshit, Dr. Ragini, and the whole team of BOA and MOS for giving me the opportunity. I'll be talking about adenoviral keratoconjunctivitis. As the name suggests, it is caused by adenovirus, which is a non-enveloped double-stranded DNA virus. And it can lead to epidemic keratoconjunctivitis. It can also cause pharyngoconjunctival fever and non-specific follicular conjunctivitis. And it is the most common cause of red eye. And it is responsible for nearly 92% of all keratoconjunctivitis cases and nearly 70% of all conjunctivitis cases. It typically occurs in the age group of 20 to 40 years, and the pharyngoconjunctival fever typically occurs in children. And many times when you get to hear that the child is having fever and then having red eye, that probably is because of the adenoviral keratoconjunctivitis in majority of cases. It is highly contagious and it spreads by, that's why it is said that don't touch the eye and then don't touch anyone else's eye or anyone else's hand. So it spreads through contact with eye care providers as well. The instrument sometimes touches an infected eye, and if it's not clean, not sterilized properly, then it can spread to another individual. And as far as the clinical feature is concerned, the clinical course is concerned, it has a biphasic clinical course, initial infective followed by inflammatory. As you see in most of the viral infections, even in COVID, it happens. So the patient has a typical symptom of excessive watering, foreign body sensation, photophobia, decreased visual acuity in some of the cases, and mucoid discharge. And when you examine the patient, you get to see these kind of pictures, with lid edema and swelling, the crusting, and conjunctival chemosis, injection, and follicular reaction in the lower tarsal conjunctiva. And in some of the cases, it can have petechial and subconjunctival hemorrhages, presence of membrane formation, pseudomembrane formation, subepithelial infiltrate, which is often talked about when you're talking about adenoviral keratoconjunctivitis. And in some of the cases, you can have superadded bacterial infection. Very rare symblepharon, it is there in the literature. That's why I mentioned it is very rare. Sometimes left untreated, these membranes can lead to formation of, symblepharon. Pseudomembranes and true membranes can definitely be, differentiated once you try to remove it. And both can be present, or either can be present in adenoviral infection. And this is what we always talk when we talk about adenoviral infection, that the patient has a subepithelial corneal nummular lesions, and these are infiltrates actually. And these are observed in close to 50% of cases, between 40 to 50% of cases. And it is typically 0.5 to 1 millimeter oval to round in shape in superficial cornea, that is subepithelial. It starts after 3 to 4 days from the onset of conjunctivitis. And it can vary as far as number and density is concerned. And that's how it affects visual acuity. If it's in the center, it is dense, it will affect the visual acuity. And in some of the cases, you get to see these hemorrhagic conjunctivitis that can be caused by adenovirus. Bacterial superinfection is less often seen, but it can be seen if you see that there's matting of lashes and there are discharges. Then this means that probably there is a bacterial superinfection as well. And as I said, pharyngoconjunctival fever, typically seen when a child is having fever and then develops conjunctivitis, and then you palpate the preauricular lymph nodes and you get to see a lymphadenopathy. So in any adenoviral infection, preauricular lymphadenopathy is something which we should always try. When we see a case of conjunctivitis, we suspect adenovirus, we should palpate the preauricular lymph nodes to see if it's there or not, to be absolutely sure that yes, it is. And it's the most common cause. So one should try to see, and that gives you an extra confidence that yes, you're dealing with adenoviral keratoconjunctivitis. What is most important is to prevent its transmission. Now, the transmission, as I said, can happen from contaminated skin, from touch, from inorganic devices, secretions, droplets, and some infected person touches his eyes and touches somebody else's hand or eye, and that can lead to transmission. It can also happen in hospitals, in crowded environments, in, if the healthcare professional is not properly maintaining hand hygiene. Of course, COVID has taught us to, maintain a proper hand hygiene. And I guess this good habit stays with all of us for very long, so that, that can prevent spread of adenoviral infection as well. Even improper use of dropper bottles with contaminated tips, the tonometer tips, etc., if they are not properly disinfected, that can cause transmission. The diagnosis is mainly clinical. However, we can do some investigations, and this RPS adeno detector has a very high sensitivity and specificity. So it can be done to document that it is a case of an adenoviral. Otherwise, diagnosis is mainly clinical, which is a self-limiting course, and it disappears by its own, as in any virus. But the sequelae creates more problems in most of the viruses, in most of the viral infections, and that is seen in adenoviral infection as well. Because if you have a membrane formation or a pseudomembrane, that can cause problems. If you have nummular exudates in the cornea, it may persist, and if there is a central nummular lesion, that can cause suboptimal visual acuity, and that can persist for very long if it's not treated properly, for months, for years, even permanently. So as I said, it's a self-limited disease. So for virus, you don't have to do anything, but you have to treat the patient for symptomatic relief, like you have to give lubricants, you give cold packs, so the patient feels better. And then in some of the cases, you may require topical antibiotics. If you grossly see that the lashes are matting and there is frank discharge happening, then in that case, you may give topical antibiotics. Otherwise, it is not given in most of the cases. And topical antihistamines and vasoconstrictors, they also reduce discomfort, so it can be given. The biggest question when we discuss about adenovirus, whether we should give topical steroid or not. The point is that topical steroid is indicated only if the person has pseudomembrane or membrane, and there are subepithelial infiltrates in the visual axis, and that is causing visual impairment. So this is an indication wherein you like to give topical steroid. Which steroid to use? Well, there are studies which have shown that the low potency steroids are as good as dexamethasone in cases of in resolution of the subepithelial infiltrates. So we can use low potency steroid in these cases. Now, what I do based on literature, based on whatever experience I have, if I see that there are some nummular infiltrates in the center of the cornea causing visual impairment, causing reduction in visual acuity, then I do use steroid. And if these infiltrates are in the center but not very confluent, then I will go for allopurinol and or fluoromethanol. But if the lesions are very confluent, causing sort of a overlapping infiltrates, in such a condition, I would prefer a stronger steroid like dexamethasone or prednisolone, maybe for 3-4 days, and then we can go ahead with a low potency steroid. I always prefer using topical cyclosporin in these cases because it is known that if you use steroid, the risk of recurrence becomes a little higher. Now, if it is indicated, if steroid is indicated, there is suboptimal visual acuity, you have to use steroid to get the resolution of infiltrates. Otherwise, it will stay permanent. So what I do is I use steroid, I use topical cyclosporin as well along with that. Taper the steroid, continue cyclosporin for some time so that, it does some immunomodulation. And although there's no study as such to show that it prevents recurrence or anything, but since it's an immunomodulator which can be used on a long-term basis, and there is definite evidence that it improves ocular surface as well, so I do use topical cyclosporin. Studies have shown good use of topical tacrolimus as well as a steroid sparing agent. If somebody is a steroid responder, tacrolimus is strong enough. For that matter, even 1% or 2% cyclosporin can be used as a steroid sparing agent. You have to prepare it in your pharmacy. Topical antivirals are very rarely used, it's there in the literature that cidofovir works. And here I would like to emphasize what Dr. Aditya was telling, that we should never use these acyclovirs or all these antivirals which we use for herpetic eye disease in cases of adenoviral infections. Cidofovir has been used, but hardly any cornea person uses, and I have never used it, and it is mostly not indicated, not required. Povidone iodine has been used in some studies, and when I discussed with a couple of colleagues of mine, they have used it and they have said that there is good response. Povidone iodine kills the virus, and dexamethasone along with that reduces inflammation. I don't have a personal experience, but there are a couple of studies which have shown good results. Just would like to emphasize here that prevention is better. We should maintain good hygiene, as we should try to prevent spread of infection. And for instruments, we should use these agents, ethyl alcohol 70% and 5% sodium chloride, hypochlorite, to disinfect the appliances that we use so that it doesn't get transmitted from one patient to the other. So in conclusion, I would like to say that adenoviral conjunctivitis is a self-limiting disease as any other viral disease. However, the management is based on symptomatic relief, and topical steroid is indicated if there are multiple nummular infiltrates in the center of the cornea causing visual deprivation. And in those cases, I prefer using topical cyclosporine along with that as well, which can be used on a long term. And prevention of transmission is something which we have to emphasize so that we get less such cases. So thank you very much for your patient hearing, and I'll be happy if there is any question.
Dr. Parikshit, you are not audible. Parikshit sir. Parikshit sir.
Parikshit, we can't hear you. Dr. Parikshit. Dr. Parikshit, we can't hear you.
Dr. Nikhil Bhai is also there.
I think we go on to the next one.
Dr. Titial sir is presenting. Thank you, Dr. Rajesh Bhai.
Good morning to all of you, and like to thank the BEO team for inviting me, especially Dr. Nikhil. We had a terrific discussion on clinical pictures, treatment of various microbial keratitis. I think there's a significant number of cases which may require a surgical intervention in terms of a therapeutic keratoplasty, and it may range from 12% to 70% of cases. Looking to various aspects of surgical aspect of treating microbial keratitis, the indication would be perforated corneal ulcers, impending corneal perforations, corneal fistula, chronic non-healing ulcers. Apart from that, two important things are to prevent the infection crossing the barrier, that is sclera or a limbus, or to decrease the chance of a blinding complication like endophthalmitis. I think these two are very important indications for surgical aspects. And we know that around 30 to 40% of keratoplasties may be therapeutic in nature, that relate to infection in many countries, more in Indian scenarios. In the epicenter, around 30% of cases are therapeutic keratoplasties. But looking into the different causes of microbial keratitis requiring therapeutic keratoplasty, around 50% of them are bacterial or fungal ulcers. And if you see here, around 35% of all cases has been cases where we could not get any cultures or any diagnostic based on a microbiology. So any patient who has significant disease but no microbial diagnosis will have more chances of undergoing keratoplasty in these cases. So how do we take a decision for these patients? I think first important thing is to document, as we talked about in the first presentation, about the size of ulcer, depth of corneal infiltration, other systemic involvement of these patients, immunocompromised or non-immunocompromised patients. Start some sort of a systemic and topical treatment as we discussed. And most importantly, apart from recording these patients, you need to have a good counseling to explain the prognosis of surgical intervention in these patients. Apart from that, and the use of donor tissue, we know that in a COVID time, we don't get good donor quality tissue. If available, we should be using a good optical tissue for these patients. Many people, we have also used glycerin preserved eyes for these patients. They also do good results. Sometimes they can be replaced with the optical graft subsequently. As far as surgical technique is concerned, the major goal of surgery in microbial keratitis is to preserve this structural integrity, to decrease the infective load, in fact, remove the entire infective load of from the eye, and ultimately have some sort of a definitive diagnosis by histopathology or culture sensitivity from the tissue which has been removed. If possible, some sort of visual rehabilitation can be done. And that will be truly dependent on the time of surgical intervention with these patients. So we need to have a right technique, especially have a good exposure in these inflamed eyes and eyelids. Always have a larger area of dissection or a removal of a tissue by trephination than the infective area. Use a sharp disposable trephines, clear the AC exudates, not only from the trephination area, also from the deeper area, which is beyond the cut area also. If possible, defer the lens surgery. Always use interrupted sutures. If possible, you can use peripheral ileectomy to prevent the subsequent pupillary block happening in these patients. If you see here, this is a large perforated corneal ulcer, and apart having a good fixation, you need to have a right selection of a trephine to encompass the entire infective area, and always go for partial trephination. Never try to do a full thickness trephination in these patients in a perforated ulcers. Otherwise, you will damage the underlying structures like iris and lens in these cases. Then you can slowly open with a blade breaker or any other MBR blade. Then subsequently, you can remove the entire infected tissue, which is at least 1 millimeter larger than the infective area. Make sure you have a good intro of hypotony in these patients, because sometimes surgery can be difficult. Removal of these exudates are very, very important up from the iris surface as well from the underneath the scleral area also. Subsequently, you can use at least 0.5 to 1 millimeter larger size of donor tissue and do a interrupted suture in these patients and form the chamber subsequently. So these are important surgical aspects for these. If you see this particular case here, so this is the area of epithelial defect and this is the area of infiltration. We go around 1 millimeter larger than that for a trephination. So once you have trephination, the tissue can be cut into 3 pieces for a bacterial, fungal, and other type cultures, and other tissue for a histopathic examination. That will give us a diagnosis, and you can change the treatment subsequently. As I talked about, timing is important. This is the ulcer, which is a localized central area, non-healing ulcer. This is, you can see after 1 year, all the sutures are intact. This is after 16 months, the sutures have been removed. So this therapeutic graft acted like an optical graft. So that is very, very important to have. This is a large ulcer. You can see this is after a month of surgery. Still, we achieved a good result in this patient. This is after 3 months. This is a patient who has again central ulcer. The results would be good, but we did have an epithelial defect, not because of host, but taking a larger tissue, tight sutures, and epithelial cell migration can be difficult. In all therapeutic grafts, epithelial defect has to be managed appropriately. Otherwise, this graft will also melt and reinfection will occur. So this is a very late stage of thinking of therapeutic keratoplasty, bound to have a failure. Anatomical success is there, but optically we have failed in this patient. This is an eccentric graft. You can see despite that, we've done a central trephination and larger trephination to have a central graft. Sometimes you have to do a peripheral trephination. You'll have a higher chance of graft rejection in this patient if the recurrence doesn't occur as such. The most important aspect of therapeutic keratoplasty is look for a recurrence happening. And we know that recurrence would happen because of various reasons, especially with etiology like Acanthamoeba fungus, larger size of ulcers, systemic disorders, intra-op inadequate clearance of infective areas, and post-op management is not appropriate. I think lamellar keratoplasty has been described in various microbial keratitis, especially for Acanthamoeba keratitis, post-LASIK infections, fungal keratitis also. And the layer by layer dissection is the most authentic way of doing a lamellar graft in these patients. Recurrence chances are much higher than the full thickness graft in these patients. I think other important aspect is the post-op management for these patients. We discussed how we manage the treatment of these patients. What about systemic antimicrobials? For bacterial keratitis, we have to initiate before surgery and continue for at least 2 weeks. For fungal keratitis, at least for 6 to 8 weeks after surgery in these cases, especially those patients where you had a larger area of involvement, limbal involvement, or where you have done a lens surgery or hyperpin was larger. For a viral keratitis, it may go on for at least 6 to 12 months. Sometimes a lifelong prophylactic dose has to be given. Topical antimicrobial has to be started in all these cases. As for fungal keratitis, again, it should be for at least 12 weeks, that is 3 months. Viral keratitis of no use is topical medication, as we discussed earlier. Same thing for acanthamoeba keratitis also. Topical drops are not very useful. Systemic may be given for a longer period of time. Steroids is again an important issue and a lot of controversies. Bacterial keratitis, we can initiate immediately. For fungal keratitis, wait for at least 1 or 3 weeks. Look for epithelialization of entire area. And recurrence is not there, we can start the steroid in these cases after at least 2 weeks. Viral keratitis, again, it will be safer with antiviral cover, systemic cover in these cases. Acanthamoeba keratitis, especially in those cases where you have severe inflammation, steroids should be given in these cases. Cycloplegic state substitute anti-glaucoma therapy is necessity for all keratoplasty. Anti-glaucoma is more important for a therapeutic graft because the glaucoma part will be much higher than a routine keratoplasty in these cases. Immediate glaucoma or a long-term glaucoma should be managed for these patients. Other important area is outcome-wise. We know that bacterial keratitis, therapeutic keratoplasty is 100% cure, and fungal around 80%, viral also 100% cure is there in these patients. Little bit of a post-DSEC DMEC infection. They act like interface infections and very difficult to manage in terms of a diagnosis and medical treatment. Surgery-wise, full thickness graft is required in these cases. Same thing for post-LASIK infections. They are basically because atypical organisms and treatment can be difficult. This is one of a patient had a LASIK surgery done. It started with a small interface infection. Ultimately, we had to do a full thickness graft in this patient. This another patient post-LASIK ICK type of picture. We did a DLK DAL for this patient, did well for 6 weeks. And again, the recurrence started. Ultimately, we had to do a full thickness graft. The interface infections are very difficult and they should be managed as per the diagnosis and involvement of various structures. I think perforation was dealt very nicely by Dr. Vikas, but some cases will require a full thickness graft, and that can be done, especially more than 3.5 millimeter perforations. What about cross-linking of therapeutic tissue also? Dr. Radhika talked about this. We also did a work on this. If you use a donor tissue which is cross-linked, would have a more resistance for keratolysis. Maybe it decreases the recurrence also. In fact, our paper was the first paper to be published in ophthalmology in 2018. In a fungal keratitis, we used cross-linked donor corneas, and we found that if you have tissue which is cross-linked, they have a better outcome in terms of lesser reinfections, a better anatomical outcome for a therapeutic keratoplasty. And Dr. Radhika talked about cross-linking the host graft junction also. That is another important part, and hope that this will be practiced for difficult cases. To summarize therapeutic keratoplasty, the indications are there in all types of microbial keratitis, right from bacterial to acanthamoeba, and it has a definite role for removing infection and preserving the integrity of eye and vision. Especially those cases where you couldn't get a diagnosis, histopath examination will give a diagnosis and you can modify your treatment, especially in acanthamoeba and fungal ulcers. Appropriate surgical technique is very, very important. If needed, you should use a general anesthesia so that you have a comfortable time, especially pediatric patients. Never forget to use a Flanagan ring in the difficult cases. And most importantly, send the tissue for a microbial culture and histopathology. And most importantly, I'd like to close this talk making intensive post-op frequent follow-up and examination and treatment is very important for successful therapeutic keratoplasty, because the recurrence rate in acanthamoeba fungus is very high and that should be taken care of. Thank you for your kind attention. I'd like to again thank the BO people for inviting us and having a wonderful session, Cornea 1 to begin with. I think we're just 3 minutes over. Dr. Agnish.
No, thank you, sir, for shepherding the session, which Dr. Nikhil has so
beautifully planned. Only thing missing was, and this COVID time, if Rajesh would have covered that, how to differentiate post-COVID conjunctivitis or a corneal involvement from an adenovirus involvement, and that would have given a little more insight to our people. We know that COVID also can have conjunctivitis and keratoconjunctivitis also. Dr. Ragini?
Sir, thank you so much, sir. We have 4 Sundays to go. Please tell us. We'll design a session for COVID. You can head it, Rajesh bhai. So we have 4 Sundays, lots of teaching. Please tell us what
this session is going to be. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Sir, details, sir. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much.
Sir, thank you.
Very nice session. Very nice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nikhil.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.